First of all, I would like to welcome and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Friends of Folk Art for the opportunity to present this lecture. My throat's a little froggy today, so I apologize, but I also want to acknowledge Laura Addison. Since 2019, she has served as the project director and coordinating curator for the Parkas show, and she's played a major role in making it the success that it is. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge my co-curator, Melissa Shaganoff. Melissa is Atna Paiute, an artist and a curator who lives in Anchorage, Alaska, and is not here today. But I've learned much from Melissa throughout this project. She was essential to our ability to foreground an Indigenous perspective throughout the exhibition. I've titled this presentation The Parka Imperative, and I hope to give you some sense of reasons Indigenous people in Alaska have had for making parkas, both in the past and nowadays, and to convey some of the complexity of the larger and smaller cultural meanings that parkas hold for Indigenous peoples in Alaska. But first, before we get to parkas, a little cultural geography. How many of you have been to Alaska? Would you raise your hand? Well, that's at least half. That's great. This is the customary map of the major native cultural groups and languages in Alaska, and I just show you this in case you haven't been there or read much about it. There are a lot of different native groups that have lived in Alaska for a long time. The parkas that we have in the show mostly come from the blue areas and from some of the red area, and then the light blue and green down on the left, Kodiak, Unangan Island, Sugpiaq. So we go into the coldest parts of the state. There are basically 9 major native cultural groups in Alaska, and there are more than 20 individual native languages that are spoken there. It's a fascinating place. This is just to understand a little bit about it. There are more federally recognized tribes in Alaska than in the lower 48 put together. There are 279 federally recognized tribes in Alaska and 245 in the lower 48. There is one Indian reservation in Alaska, but otherwise there are not. The reason that Alaska Natives don't live in the reservation system is because of the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And this is has complicated implications. It was passed 50 years ago by Congress, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but I'll just simply say it created regional corporations and village corporations in order to administer the distribution of funds and lands so that the indigenous land claims, which had never been settled, could be legally settled and the construction of the Alaska pipeline proceed. The pipeline could not be built until they got the land claims settled, so that had an awful lot to do with it. And the pipeline goes from the very northern tip of Alaska, near Utqiagvik or Barrow, down more than 800 miles south to the Port of Valdez on Prince William Sound. So it covers a lot of territory. One way this is important when we're thinking in terms of parkas is realizing that the Alaska Native people have been in and on their own homelands for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. and their knowledge of and the relationship of their environments are both incredibly deep and complex. What is the Parka imperative? For hundreds of years, it was survival and beauty, but today, perhaps the most important Parka imperative is cultural survival. Parkas have been a means of survival, of keeping warm and dry, and parkas are rich with cultural dimensions and now seen as a means of cultural survival, especially for younger women, 40 and under, who are making parkas today. Parkas contain knowledge and meaning. Their designs of them are related to family identity, maybe related to regional or cultural identity, gender identity. And within a Native worldview, a parka represents the proper relationship between individuals and between people and animals. And then we'll also talk a little bit, or I will, about the importance of women's roles in parka making. When starting this process back in 2019, in addition to becoming familiar with the ethnographic literature on parkas, we brought together a group of Indigenous parka makers, skin sewers, and culture bearers in Anchorage for a 3-day colloquium as part of our exhibition planning. We were interested in foregrounding an Indigenous perspective in the exhibition. We met as a group, we looked at and talked about parkas, and we conducted individual interviews with each participant, recording both the group discussions and the interviews. While we usually think of traditional arts such as parka making being learned and passed down from mother to daughter, we learned from our colloquium participants that it is often more complicated than that these days. One participant, Mary Lou Sowers, the woman near the center resting her chin on her hand in the photo, who is from Kotzebue and Noatak above the Arctic Circle in the Northwest Arctic, said she first started making parkas when her first grandson was born. She said, when he was first born, I immediately knew that I had to sew for him, so I really just dug in and went for it. I didn't really have anyone to teach me, but I went ahead and observed other parkas and looked online and asked questions here and there. It's been a learning experience, and I started off making mostly things for babies. Once I knew I could do it, I moved up to adults. My grandson is 6 years old now, going on 7. I've been sewing since I was a little girl. My mom taught me, and she had access to all the furs because my dad trapped a lot. I've been doing it for a while, but it took a while to get started making a parka. Once I had a grandson, something in me clicked, and I knew I had to sew one for him. She continues, my parents, I call them my parents, but they're really my bio mom's aunt and uncle family. My mom passed away and they raised me and adopted me. I lived with them since I was 3. My dad, he was a trapper and a hunter. He would go out and trap the animals or shoot them, bring them home. He would skin the animals, then my mom would wash them, flesh them, stretch them, tan them, cut them up, sew, make parkies, make ruffs, mittens, different things. They had a good connection, teamwork. They worked together. It was pretty awesome because I got to see them work together. And just that relationship in itself, you don't see that anymore hardly. When asked why it was important for women to make parkas, Mary Lou answered, it is to keep the tradition alive, to keep the culture alive, to keep it thriving. It's our identity. She said, I love to sew and I've been working on how to teach others how to sew, making muklaks or hard-bottom soles for the muklaks, teaching classes or taking orders from my small business. Mary Lou had a Facebook page called Inupiaq Mary Custom Designs, where she generously shared advice and instruction on skin sewing, parka rough making. She posted photos of her work step by step, and she showed pictures of her students' works. She was always willing to share information. She said, "For me, today, it's keeping our tradition alive. Since I started sewing, once you become a seamstress, you want to make all kinds of things. And parkas are really important because you not only clothe your babies, but you clothe your family, and you have this nice regalia, this attire to display and to wear, and to pass on your tradition and your culture." She concluded, "It's really important because we don't want to lose our identity. We want to keep our culture alive." Part of the knowledge and meaning parkas contain has to do with family identity. In this picture from the colloquium, on the left is Bobby Brower, and on the right, Carrie Anvil looking at gut parka. Bobby Brower grew up in Ghhúunayúkata at the most northern tip of Alaska. When I first moved up to Alaska in 1980, it was called Barrow, but it has gone back officially to its Inupiaq name. Asked in her interview, "What compelled you to make parkas at age 25, Bobby answered, "To keep my kids warm. And I wanted them to wear trad clothing. It's kind of who we are, like our identity. I want them to feel proud of our culture. When I was growing up, I only had one parka and I didn't take care of it. I was really young. But when I got to middle school, I almost kind of didn't like my culture. A lot of people looked down on it. So making parkas was kind of a way to bring it back and make it like, this is who we are. These are beautiful coats that we make, and no one else makes them. We have got to keep the traditions and not be ashamed of who we are." Bobby also talked about the importance of a part of the parka known in her Inupiaq language as the kupak. This is a patterned geometric trim along the bottom border of a parka. And she spoke of the importance of the kupak as a family design. She said, "A kupak is a design that you put on your parka. There's kupaks for velveteen parkas that are made out of bias tape, and they're layered. And in the exhibit, you can see a blue velveteen parka that Bobby made that has the bias tape layered kupak on it. Then she said there's the kupaks for fancy fur parkas. They're typically made out of calf skin, and you draw out a design on graph paper. I typically tell my parka students to look at family pictures and to draw a design from your own family. Maybe you can alter it in a way to make it yours, to make it a little different so it will signify that it's your design. But it's also from your family as well. Mine, I kind of made my own design because my grandmother had her kupak design. But it's only one style, and a lot of my aunts already use it because my dad is one of 17 kids, and there's 11 sisters. So a lot of them have used this pattern, and I wanted to make something that was just mine. The next several slides I'll show you are examples of different kupak designs on fur parkas. This is a parka by Eleanor Norton from Kotzebue. This is a parka by Mary Lynn Sowers that includes both pieced black and white calfskin work and beadwork. This is a muskrat parka that has pieced calfskin design in a stepped pattern. This is actually up on the shoulder of a sealskin parka, but it is the kupak design that is also referenced in the design along the bottom of the parka. This is a parka in the exhibit, and if you look closely, the kupak along the bottom of the parka has in between these humps or mountains or whatever they are, the letters spelling out Alaska. And each of these rows, the brown with the white pieced into it, a narrow white row, a little black separating it, a little bit wider white row, a little bit of a black and some white. Those are all seams there. Those are all separate pieces that have been sewn together and inserted into the seams. The black is probably a kind of fish skin, a dark fish skin from a fish that doesn't have scales, maybe burbot or sheefish, and then also little pieces of red yarn that in the old days may have actually been disentangled from a blanket rather than purchased as yarn. There is a lot of work and everything is pieced together. It's not appliqued on. This is from a parka in the exhibit by Mary Samuelson, who is a Yupik woman from Bethel. And again, you can see the layers that are pieced together, white, black, white, red kind of binding in the seam, then a whiter white. Here the stars are cut out and sewn in, so they're pieced into it with the bead in the center. Then a kind of black tape, and then green and red beadwork, more white calf skin, and then black calf skin with black and white beads on it. And then below that is the wolverine fur at the bottom of the parka. Because parkas may carry family designs, they often play an important role in Yupik weddings. The Yupik are the ones down in the west, southwest, and central west area of Alaska, in the Ghhúunayúkata Delta, in that big area. So in Yupik weddings, the bride joins the family of her husband, and as Yupik elder Marie Mead wrote, the parka is given to the new bride of the family by the husband, by the family of the husband. It is like a gift of your wealth, which is not just wealth of materials, but a wealth of information, a wealth of your family history. The new bride, wearing a fancy parka trimmed with a kupak with her husband's family design, is signaling to her community every time she wears it about her changed status and her membership in a new family. In this picture, we have Bobby on the left, a Yupik woman named Olga Guy in the middle, and on the right, Elaine Kingacook, who's from Sylvanga, Alaska, on St. Lawrence Island, and they're looking at a St. Lawrence Island ceremonial parkas, one of the real prize pieces in the exhibition and in the collection of this museum. Olga Guy is Yupik from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. She's originally from the village of Ghhúunayúkata, and she now lives in Anchorage. Olga did not learn to make parkas from her mother or her grandmother, although she recalls as a small girl loving to watch her grandmother sew on furs and on fabric. Olga did not have the opportunity to make a parka until she was 32 and married, when a friend told her about the Alaska State Arts Council's Master Apprentice Program. Olga applied and was awarded a grant to work with a well-known Yupik parka maker, Anna Anvil. And in describing the apprentice and learning from Anna, Olga said, quote, "It was a good experience for me since I loved to sew. I had a lot of questions and she had a lot of answers. When we started the sewing, she would tell me a lot of different stories. When she got to each different part of sewing the parka, she would have a different story, and that was interesting. That made me more, I want to do this. I want to make more parkas." This is Olga on the right, and this is the parka she made working in the apprenticeship program, her first parka. And on the left, Elaine is wearing her St. Lawrence Island ceremonial regalia and fancy mucklucks. This is on the lawn out in front of the Anchorage Museum. Elaine Ghúunayúkata is from Savunga, one of 2 villages on St. Lawrence Island. St. Lawrence Island is 200 miles west of Nome in the Bering Sea and 40 miles from Siberia. Elaine is known for her work on seal gut. She does not make full-size parkas because she has not had access to sufficient quantities of material. Much of the gut that she works with are pieces that she has inherited when her auntie and her mother passed away. She makes gut parkas for dolls, and she creates what she calls baskets, small containers made of seal intestine. She has also worked with a number of museums, including the Smithsonian, advising on the care for and repair of gut parkas in their collections. Elaine recalls first learning to sew when she was 6 years old, and she soon, as a little girl, was making Eskimo yo-yos to sell. Her work with gut began in the late 1970s. Here, Olga and Elaine are holding 2 of the gut baskets that Elaine makes these days. These small gut containers that she makes, she describes as, quote, teaching tools for you to learn gut sewing. Elaine agrees with the statement of another doll maker, an Inupiaq doll maker, Kathy Ward, that, quote, the parka is where you learn your culture. Gesturing to several of her gut baskets on the table behind her, Elaine said, basket making is more like a teaching tool for you to learn gut sewing. You practice by making gut and the designs and the stitching. Gesturing towards some stitching on a small basket, she says, this is the stitching you would use on a mukluk sole. And gesturing toward a large gut basket, she comments on how the decoration is like the crested auklet decoration on the ceremonial gut parkas from her island. And you can see this in the basket that Olga is holding. Those little tabs it's a little tab, in this case, of orange dyed sealskin and some little black fur to mimic the auklet crests that traditionally were used on the ceremonial gut parkas. Elaine notes that the top of the half of the basket is quote-unquote freeze-dried or winter bleached, and it is opaque, and the bottom half is warm-dried or has been dried out in the spring or summer sun and is thus translucent gut. So you can see how those really can be used as teaching tools. Elaine says that she has the kids feel and touch the baskets, and this is the first step in teaching gut parka education, and probably educational for survival, for hunting as well. During the colloquium, she told us a long story about some hunters in her family who had been out walrus hunting and they got stranded on sea ice in bad weather. And this long story got very highly dramatic and charged, and about how it turned out gut parkas were critical in keeping them dry and saving their lives. So, parkas contain knowledge and meaning, regional culture and identity. This is Tuna McIntyre, and this is an example of some regional cultural identity in his parka. Tuna McIntyre is originally from Eek, and the village of Eek is a Yupik parka maker, and he's lived outside of Alaska for quite a number of years, but travels back often, and gives wonderful presentations on skin sewing, parka making, and Yupik dance as well. Some of you may have seen him before somewhere. This parka carries some design elements that represent a traditional historical narrative from the area he's from. The story goes as follows, quote, "In times of warfare and madness, there was an ancestor, it is said in our stories, whose name was Aponagok. One day he was sitting down eating caribou. He loved caribou fat. He was just sitting there eating his favorite food, not minding his surroundings, which he should have been, because we were in wartime. Suddenly, from across the river, there were two warriors approaching. They were already too close for him to make a quick escape. So he stood up, caribou fat dribbling from his mouth, and he started to climb the mountain in front of him. Each time he turned around to look, caribou fat would drip onto parts of his clothing. That is how these dribbles of caribou fat became our emblems. We call them Nerutai, quote, his reason for eating. On his escape, Aponagok also regurgitated caribou fat onto his parka front. They too became our emblems, called Yaru, I can't pronounce his meaning representations of his regurgitant. During his escape, Aponagok was shot by an arrow by one of the warriors. The arrow went in one side of his body and came out the other. But he didn't die because he quickly did some magic. He was a shaman. He healed himself, continued to climb the mountain, and escaped down the other side. So tassels placed on either side of the parka are his arrow emblems, which we call, a Yupik term, pitagachautit, for arrows. All of these design elements, he said, mean quite a lot to us. So the top photo on your left is a detail showing the frontal designs on the garment, where the white vertical strip of fur in the center and the two narrow white bands show the dribbles of white caribou fat. That's what they represent. And then in the bottom image, where you see him holding out tassels on either side, those represent the regurgitant of the ancestor. So there are stories like this connected to different parkas from different areas, and they're not just this parka with this story. I have talked to other parka makers 30 years ago, and they have told the same story about the different tassels and inserts in their parka. Okay, parkas contain knowledge and meaning, gender identity. This is an engraving on a walrus tusk of a woman dancing somewhere on the Seward Peninsula, and this depicts the style of parka that women in northern Alaska wore up until the late 19th, early 20th century. What's noticeable about it is that the hem of the woman's parka is curved and somewhat longer in the back. If you think about the Inupiaq woman's work at that time, processing animals while she was standing and bending over, or sewing while she was sitting on the floor or the ground with her legs straight out in front of her, this cut to the parka hem makes all kinds of ergonomic sense. It would be very hard to do if your parka was not cut up and just went straight down to the hem. This drawing was made by a student in the first school in the northwest Inupiaq village of Wales in 1892. It has a caption, perhaps written by the teacher on it, that says, "This shows very correctly," I think that's the teacher part, "the dress of a thrifty woman who is rich. According to Eskimo ideas, this parka is trimmed more than average." And here you see that deep curved hem in the woman's parka. And again, trimmed more than average, with a lot of dangles and fur and wolverine on your parka. That was also a sign of status and wealth and the excellence of your husband as a great hunter. This is a parka in the exhibit, one from Moifa's collection. It's a squirrel skin, Arctic brown squirrel parka from Northwest Arctic at the turn of the century. And it features the curved hem front and back. And you will see this. Yupik women's parkas from central and southwest Alaska also had curved hems at this time, but the curve was much shallower. And in all cases, men's parkas had straight hems. You know, if you think you're out in a blizzard in the snow and it's the north part of Alaska and it's December or January and there's not much light and you see somebody coming, these things are clues as to whether it's a man or a woman, if you can imagine. Parkas contain knowledge and meaning. Within the Native worldview, they represent the proper relationship between individuals and between people and animals. This is that same parka, a view of the back of its hood. It's quite interesting. It's pieced together of more than 20 small squares of squirrel skin. Each square is a squirrel head. The hood is perhaps the most important part of the parka, and this piecework symbolizes a couple of things. It demonstrates using every possible part of the animal, not letting anything go to waste. This is one of the ways in the Indigenous worldview of showing respect to the animal. Also, the use of squirrel heads on the hood represents symbolically a congruence between the animal and the human. And we will see another example of that process in another parka. This is a child's caribou parka. This is the front of it. And this is the back of it. The back, here you see the back of the parka, which is made from the back of a young caribou, and the tail has been left on. Also, the back of the hood is the back of the caribou head with the ears left on. And again, that congruence that people talk about between animals and human, and that's part of also the reason their skins work so well for clothing for humans. And in this photo, which this parka is in the exhibit, it's from the Anchorage Museum, but you can't see the inside of it, so this is a sneak photo taken of an inside seam in the child's parka. And here you see a wolf claw, which has been sewn into the seam, which serves as an amulet to confer the qualities of the wolf on the child, to confer the qualities of strength, of power, of speed to the young boy who would be wearing the parka. Scholar Valerie Chaussonnet, who wrote a wonderful article entitled Needles and Animals, Woman's Magic for the Smithsonian's Crossroads of Continents catalog, comments on the relationship between the hunter and the seamstress. She wrote, animal skin transformed into a second skin for the human by the work of seamstresses will maintain its animal identity. From the killing of the animal through the tanning, sewing its skin into a piece of clothing, the qualities and characteristics attributed to it in life were maintained and passed on to the wearer of the finished garment. The important spiritual principle linked animals, hunters, and seamstresses together in an intricate and circular set of relationships. She notes further, a direct consequence of the continuum between live animals and animal products for clothing was that women had to observe certain rules in their art and show respect for the materials, as did the hunters of the game. In addition, the clothing they produced had to be beautiful. with regular and perfect stitches so that the hunter wearing the garment would please the game. The seamstresses helped reconcile humans and animals, not only by indirectly participating in hunting, but also reinforcing the transformational relationship between them in the clothing that she made. Seamstresses of the North Pacific region signified, quote, the human-animal symbiosis by the use of tailored animal parts to cover corresponding parts of the human body. This was an extremely common practice in parka making. For example, quote, hoods were usually made from the skin of the head of the caribou, the fox, the dog, or the wolf, on which the ears were often preserved. Animal tails were universally incorporated into the garments, and sometimes wolverine tails were even attached to belts worn by men around their waist over a parka. At the broadest level for all Alaska Native cultures, their worldviews see animals such as caribou, seal, and others as beings that participate in a moral, ecological universe in which these animals, quote, give themselves to the hunters who treat them with respect. This respect is shown when a hunter uses well-made and well-maintained gear, when a hunter takes careful, clean shots that minimize suffering, which also, by the way, results in better hides for clothing or boats. When a hunter takes the animal in the appropriate season. In many Alaska Native groups, the hunter, when an animal has been captured before it is butchered, when it is a sea mammal, the hunter will give it a final drink of fresh water to show his gratitude in this highly symbolic action. King Island elder Margaret Sagana wrote in an essay on traditional King Island life that is in a book. When a young hunter killed his first seal or other sea mammal, it was an occasion of great importance for his family. The hunter gave the catch away to a close relative, often to a needy widow with small children, hoping that the animal's spirits would be appeased, that he would someday become a great hunter. In Yupik societies, it was believed that the soul of an animal, such as a seal, resided in the animal's bladder. So when a seal was caught and butchered for its meat, its fat rendered for oil, its hide processed for clothing, the bladder was removed, inflated, and saved. Then in an annual bladder festival, which was held in the village each winter at solstice time, the bladders would be brought to the ceremonial house, the Kazgi, where the dancers and ceremonies take place, dances and ceremonies take place. And at one point in the ceremony, all the bladders, which were suspended from the ceiling, would be taken down and taken outside down to the ocean, where they were then put back into the ocean through a hole cut in the ice, in order to return the seal's spirits and reunite them, thus assuring the continuation of a healthy seal population. Ethnographer Anne Fina Brereton, who has spent decades working with Yupik people, writes that the bladder festival sought to, quote, reverse the separation of body and soul effected at the time of the seal's death, and to ensure the animal's rebirth in the coming harvest season. Okay, more knowledge and meaning, the importance of women's roles. This drawing by Inupiaq artist Kivitork Moses, which is in the exhibit, shows the woman's role in the processing of seals, the butchering. She's butchering the seal. You see the seal skin stretched out on the snow. You see a seal poke hanging off the end of the racks, probably full of seal oil. And then you see seal meat drying on the racks. All work that occurs before any sewing begins. A Yupik elder, John Phillips, remarked in a 2010 museum consultation, quote, "By taking care of his catches, a wife makes her husband a good hunter. Conversely, a previously good hunter will lose his ability to bring home animals if his wife does not take care of them." Comments from Yupik women Teresa John and her mother Martina John in interviews with Ann Fina Burden address this issue. A woman's sewing skills were vital to the health and well-being of the entire family, Teresa said. A wife's effort to support her husband in his harvesting activities were particularly important. That's why women are responsible for the family having things. If a woman doesn't take care of the animal that a man brings home, it cannot become anything. If a woman doesn't process it, it can rot. A woman was responsible for all things that a man continually obtained in the wilderness and brought home. The respectful hunter will wear well-made, beautifully sewn clothing, a parka that conveys to the caribou or to the wolverine that the hides and furs that they provide will be treated respectfully and sewn into beautiful garments. This creates an important motivation for the skin sewer to create beautiful, well-made parkas. Okay, what else do parkas do? Keep us warm, keep them warm. This is an adult caribou parka, and this is in the exhibit. It is from the collection here, and it's a prime example of the parka imperative to keep them warm. Caribou parkas are the warmest of all fur parkas because of this. This is a detail from an electron microscope slide. It shows a cross-section of a single caribou hair. It shows that the hair is hollow and filled with small chambers of air. It has been described as looking like bubble wrap. This provides tremendous insulation. And coupled with this physical property of caribou hair, the Inupiaq practice of making an underparka that is worn by the hunter with the hair against his body, covered by a second overparka, such as the one shown here, provides maximum insulation in the hunter when you're out in 40 or 50 or 60 below temperatures. Also very warm are birdskin parkas. Another way of keeping warm, especially in the coastal areas of Alaska and on islands such as Nunivak Island or St. Lawrence Island, where this parka is from, is to make and wear birdskin parkas. Here you are looking at the original down parka, and a beautiful one at that, if I may say so. Waterproof parkas. Sometimes your concern is more about staying dry, and you need a waterproof garment that you could wear as an over parka over your fur parka or your bird parka. You might consider a parka made of sea mammal gut, or if you're inland, of bear gut, or a fish skin of salmon skin. Some parkas are more waterproof than warm. This is a picture of Martina John, a Yupik elder, at the museum in Bethel, and we're preparing for the installation of an exhibit there about Yupik technology, and she is providing some seal intestine for the exhibit. So she had it frozen and got it out and inflated it, and then we strung it out along the walkway to the museum, and later then coiled it up to hang it in the exhibit. But that's what it looks like when a seamstress is working on it. This is a walrus or ugruk. Ugruk's the bearded seal, the largest seal with the thickest intestine of all the seals. Parka, a child's parka, and this is in the show. One of the things important to notice about it is that these waterproof parkas are only waterproof if they have waterproof seams. And here is one of the techniques used to make a seam waterproof. Alongside the seam stitched into it on the left-hand side, you see strands of beach grass. So should the parka get water splashed onto it and get moist, the grass swells up and seals the holes made by the needle in the parka. In this glimpse in sideways through the end of a sleeve, you can see some seams that have grass sewn into them. There are 2 or 3 ways of making waterproof seams. This parka, also a gut parka, is from the Aleutian Island chains. It's an Ghhúunayúkata parka. It's very similar to 19th century parkas shown in the Edelin catalog of collections that are now in the National Museum of Finland, but came out of Australia in the 1870s and 1880s. This is perhaps from the Pribilof Islands. It looks much like parkas that are documented as being from the Pribilof Islands. This parka from this museum's collection, they have some wonderful ones. It surprised me coming from Alaska to see such great Alaska Native materials here. This parka was examined before the exhibit by Sven Hawkinson. Sven is a Supiaq anthropologist. He's originally from Old Harbor, which is near Kodiak Island. He's currently a curator at the Burke Museum, and he's head of the anthropology department at the University of Washington. He wrote about hunters' gut parkas for our exhibition catalog, and he commented on seeing this particular Ghhúunayúkata parka in our collection. He wrote, "The Ghhúunayúkata gut skin jacket shared here is a testament to the ingenuity of our ancestors, who were thriving across our waters before colonization. It is our responsibility to learn and share this knowledge that is embodied within each cultural piece and more with our community members, teaching the next generation how to make and use their own jackets that are waterproof, breathable, and a perfectly designed coat for hunting in a kayak is something I have never read from anyone who has described this type of parka before. We have a long road ahead of us in order to change how we see and understand our traditional materials within a living context." Sven, when he interviewed Supiaq elder Larry Matfay, he said Larry described how hunters knew if the weather was going to be safe or not by watching the blinking of the North Star early in the morning. Sven said, "We have to find our own blinking North Stars so that we can thrive once again in our waters. For me, objects like this Ghhúunayúkata parka are our blinking light to guide us in sharing the ingenuity and brilliance from our ancestors. We have a responsibility to learn and ensure this knowledge is not lost to the next generation." And finally, I'd like to end this presentation with the words of Marie Mead, a Yupik scholar, about a different kind of parka, a fancy fur parka. Marie wrote, "One of the significant pieces of our culture that still remains is a fancy parka. The parka is like a book. It tells a story. The designs and symbols on our parka are our way of writing pertinent and important information. They are our way of connecting not only with each other, but with our environment and our world. We created what we saw as a design, and we recorded our history. For centuries, this method of recording has enabled our heritage to survive. The parka is like a declaration and an expression of our will and our desire to continue our culture. A parka is a beautiful art form. It is our cultural heirloom, which we call paitak. The parka itself, the individual parka will disappear from use and age, but the design will survive. The parka will eventually fall apart, but the idea will never fall apart. It will be sustained. Thank you.